With every soldier under Custer's immediate command killed, the story of his death was rewritten by those who weren't there. Generals seeking to save their reputations and politicians creating a national martyr. But one testimony of a man dismantles their entire fabrication. His account, buried for over 60 years, doesn't just challenge the legend. It proves Custer never made it to Last Stand Hill, and provides the definitive answer to the battle's greatest mystery: why the warriors who mutilated every other soldier chose to spare the body of their most hated enemy. Cheyenne warrior White Cow Bull knew this because he'd been the one to kill Custer. White Cow Bull's story of the Little Bighorn is utterly unique because of his connection with two people who are so often ignored in the history of the battle. White Cow Bull actually saw a Custer early in the morning, except this wasn't the Custer everyone knew. This Custer was only 7 years old, the forgotten child of an affair between a Cheyenne woman and the famous Indian fighting officer. The boy's name was Yellowbird, yellow for the iconic hair color that the boy inherited from his father. The mother's name was Monacetta, and she had met Custer years earlier in 1868, when Custer had attacked her family's camp on the Washita River. Her father, Chief Little Rock, had been killed in what is more fairly called a massacre than a battle. Monacetta was taken as a captive, but Custer took a liking to her, keeping her around as an interpreter and apparently a lover. White Cow Bull wasn't alone in this belief. It was common knowledge among the Cheyenne that Monacetta had borne Custer a son. It was also common knowledge in the 7th Cavalry itself. The regiment's surgeon at the time and even Captain Frederick Benteen confirmed that Custer had several affairs during the Washita campaign, including with Monacetta. It is indisputable that Custer was fond of her. In fact, in his own book, My Life on the Plains, he describes her as an exceedingly comely woman, possessing a bright, cheery face, a countenance beaming with intelligence, and a disposition more inclined to be merry than one usually finds among the Indians. Custer is most likely alluding to Monacetta in a letter to his wife during the Washita campaign, where he apologized to her for, quote, "however erratic, wild, or unseemly my conduct with others may have been." Many historians believe he is apologizing for having an affair. The nature of their relationship is unclear. Many believe it was non-consensual. Others, including the claimed descendants of Monacetta, have challenged this, saying that Monacetta consented and considered him to be her husband. There's also the possibility that it wasn't George Custer's son at all, but rather his nephew. It is also believed that Monacetta had a relationship with Captain Tom Custer around the same time. Allegedly, her son was nicknamed Tom by some of the officers in the 7th after he was born. One theory claims that George Custer may have been sterile thanks to an STD infection years earlier, which would also explain why he never had children with Libby, although this has never been proven. Either way, Monacetta bore a son to one of the Custer brothers, and this was common knowledge among her people. Monacetta was in her mid to late 20s by the time of the Little Bighorn. Being a single mother, no one wanted to marry her in her tribe, but White Cow Bull thought she was beautiful. He had been courting her for a while already, and wanted to make her his wife. On the morning of June 25th, White Cow Bull spotted Monacetta and her son carrying firewood up from the river. He smiled at them, hoping to meet her later that night, after the boy had gone to sleep. He could not have known that in a few short hours, he would kill the boy's father. White Cow Bull was at the Cheyenne camp circle on the far end of the village when Major Marcus Reno opened the attack later that morning. By the time he'd grabbed his weapons and mounted his horse, though, a new warning came. "They're coming this way, across the ford. We must stop them," shouted one of the warriors. Custer with his 5 companies had appeared on the hills to the east of the camp, and were now approaching down Medicine Trail Coulee, aiming to cross into the village while the warriors were distracted by Reno. White Cow Bull and a handful of other warriors quickly changed course and rushed to the riverside to meet them. As they reached the river, they saw a group of Sioux scouts fleeing down the hills on the far side, with the American troops hotly in pursuit. White Cow Bull and his fellow warriors opened fire to cover the fleeing Sioux. It was enough to allow the men to flee back over the river before the Americans could close in. The Americans stopped at the river's edge where he could get a good look at them. White Cow Bull had never seen a white man before. They looked strange to him, all pink and hairy. One in particular caught his eye. He recalled a man with a mustache wearing a big hat and a buckskin jacket, sitting atop a sorrel horse with 4 white socks. A flag bearer rode on one side of him, and on the other a smaller, darker man on a horse. The soldiers opened fire and the native warriors returned it. The man in the buckskin coat shouted orders at his men, so White Cow Bull realized he must have been their leader. Then the leader opened fire in White Cow Bull's direction, nearly hitting him several times as the rest of the soldiers prepared to cross the river. White Cow Bull answered in turn, raising his repeating rifle and firing a single shot that knocked the leader off his horse. White Cow Bull did not know it at the time, but he may have just killed Long-Hair Custer. Custer's death at the Little Bighorn has been the subject of numerous claims and endless myth-making. The potent symbol of Custer going down fighting atop Last Stand Hill amidst the bodies of his fallen men is iconic and powerful. But if White Cow Bull is to be believed, it is simply a myth. While many native warriors claim to have been the one to kill Custer, White Cow Bull's account contains several particular details that make his case the strongest. Firstly, his description of the encounter at the river ford is backed up by several witnesses, both from his allied natives and surviving Crow scouts working for Custer like Curly and Goes Ahead. Secondly, his description of Custer and his horse are corroborated by American and native sources. Custer was the only officer who was riding a sorrel horse with 4 white socks on that day. Meanwhile, the small dark man riding next to Custer was almost certainly his chief scout, Mitch Boyer, who was of mixed white and Native American ancestry, and would indeed have been riding at his side. Custer dying at the river early in the fight would explain the near-instant retreat back up the hill that native accounts and archaeological evidence suggested. White Cow Bull describes how the soldiers stopped their advance and, quote, seemed to be dragging something out of the water before retreating. They were probably retrieving their fallen leader rather than leave it in the hands of the enemy. Injuries later found on Custer's body also imply a more complicated death. Custer was found with 2 bullet wounds, one in his chest and one in his head. It has been speculated that the head wound was a mercy kill to avoid capture and mutilation. This would make sense if the chest wound was White Cow Bull's earlier bullet. The likely scenario is that White Cow Bull mortally wounded Custer with a shot to the chest, and his men carried him back to the hill where he was put out of his misery with a shot to the head. If this is true, what came next was not the story of dramatic heroism we were told, but of panic and despair. If Custer truly did fall at the river, then our image of his men's last stand is radically different. White Cow Bull claimed that the attacking soldiers instantly stopped advancing when their leader fell. The men rushed to gather his body and then began a retreat back up the bluffs on the far side of the Little Bighorn. At this moment, hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors arrived, having successfully driven off Major Reno's attack. With a wave of reinforcements and their enemy in retreat, the mood of the battle completely changed. The Lakota and Cheyenne would now go on the offensive. "Come on! They are running! Hurry!" shouted his fellow warriors. White Cow Bull was one of the first warriors to charge across the river. He later admitted that he was trying to show off in front of the Cheyenne warriors so that one of them would tell Monticello about his bravery. His version of the 7th Cavalry's retreat up the hill is one of chaos. The Americans could not make an effective resistance as native warriors charged in to Kunku and displayed their bravery. White Cow Bull himself did not boast of Kunku in battle. Strangely humble admission from a warrior like him. Instead, he hung back and shot at retreating soldiers as they split off into 2 groups to Last Stand Hill and Calhoun Hill, where Custer's men would make 2 separate final stands. He counted 5 men who fell to his bullets in that retreat. Staying back allowed White Cow Bull a full view of the battle. Contrary to the popular myth of American soldiers fighting to their last breath, according to White Cow Bull, the last man did not die fighting. One lone rider rode off from the battle on his horse, with Cheyenne and Lakota in pursuit. I saw him yank out his revolver and thought he was going to shoot back at these warriors. Instead, he put the revolver in his head, pulled the trigger, and fell dead. The man's death was not courageous in White Cow Bull's eyes, but he conceded that the rest of the men, quote, fought well and died in courage. Of course, he did not believe Custer was among them. If this account is to be believed, the 200 men with Custer fought their final moments after their commander had already fallen. White Cow Bull's story explains those men's final moments, but his claims of what came next answer one of the greatest mysteries that was hung over the battle ever since. The battle was over within an hour. We had killed them all, White Cow Bull said. The warriors cheered and yelled so loudly that the women and children back in the village came up to investigate. It was time to locate their own dead, capture the Americans' lost horses, and enact their own vengeance upon the bodies of the fallen soldiers. White Cow Bull was no different. He began searching bodies for bullets and weapons or any other treasures as a prize for his victory. He spent some time combing over the battlefield before he ended up near the top of the ridge, where one of the groups of soldiers had made their last stand. There he found the naked body of the man he'd shot down by the river. The buckskin jacket and hat were long gone now, but he still recognized the mustache. The man had come close to shooting White Cow Bull several times, so he decided to cut off the man's trigger finger, hoping that the dead man's medicine power would make him a better shot. But as White Cow Bull took out his knife, a woman's voice suddenly stopped him. Monacetta was standing there, along with Little Yellowbird and an older Cheyenne woman. "He is our relative," they warned him. They would not allow him to be mutilated. At the time, White Cow Bull still had no idea who the man was. He smiled at Monacetta, but she didn't smile back. I decided she wouldn't be as proud of me if I cut off the white man's finger, and moved away. White Cow Bull watched from a distance as the woman bent down over the body. Monacetta stayed quiet, but the older woman took out her sewing awl and drove it deeply into the dead man's ears. "So Longhair will hear better in the spirit land," the old woman explained. That was when White Cow Bull first discovered that the man he'd killed had been the legendary long-haired chief, who had caused so much grief for his people. Now he understood why Monacetta had not wanted him to harm the man's body. Historians have always been puzzled why Custer was one of the only men whose body was not scalped or heavily mutilated when every other body around him was. If no one else recognized who he was, there would have been no reason to spare him. But if people did recognize him, then scalping the great enemy would have been a top priority. White Cow Bull offers the best explanation, with Monacetta stepping in to protect her former lover's body. White Cow Bull did not rejoin the fighting against the survivors on Reno Hill the following day, nor did he boast to anyone about slaying Custer. Perhaps he realized that it would only hurt his chances with Monacetta, so he decided to keep quiet. However, after Sitting Bull's followers left the Little Bighorn the following evening, his Oglala Lakota parted ways with Monacetta's Cheyenne, and he never saw her again. White Cow Bull's story challenges the accepted narrative of the battle, but perhaps no other Native account has so much support in other accounts. While most Native accounts claim Custer fell during the last stand, none agree on what happened or who took the kill. The only warrior whose account has clear external support is White Cow Bull's, with both Cheyenne warriors and Custer's own Crow scouts corroborating that Custer was shot down in the river early in the battle. Even White Cow Bull's description of his horse and outfit are supported by multiple other accounts, including from American survivors like Edward Godfrey. Other particular details in his story are also backed up by other witnesses. Several warriors independently offered the same story of a lone soldier riding away from the battle to take his own life, now believed to have been Lieutenant Henry M. Harrington of C Company, whose body was never found. The Cheyenne warrior Dives Backward also witnessed an unknown Lakota warrior being driven away from a white man's body by two women who then rammed a sewing awl into his ears. Still, there are doubts to be raised. His story feels far too neat to be reality. The same man who courted Custer's former mistress being the one to unknowingly kill him in battle seems far too much like a crafted story. Although White Cow Bull has support from other accounts, it is still only a small minority. We must also consider that White Cow Bull did not share his story until 1937, long after other witnesses were dead, and his recollection could have been influenced by any number of other publicized accounts shared in the 60 years since the battle. It might not be the case that White Cow Bull was being backed up by other accounts, but he was borrowing from those accounts to make his own seem more accurate. There is no way to conclusively prove that White Cow Bull's version of events is the closest to the truth. However, his attention to detail, his corroboration by several other witnesses, and a distinct lack of boasting compared to the other warriors make a strong case for his trustworthiness. It may then be true that in his quest to win the heart of the woman he loved, White Cow Bull unknowingly struck down the man who'd fathered that woman's child, and ended the life of his people's most infamous enemy.